11 reasons why Labour is the most bigoted, racist, fascist and dangerous political party in Britain. Far more dangerous than the Tories, UKIP or even the BNP. That's right. And I've got some pretty good arguments here which I've put to many Labour supporters in person and to which I'm yet to hear a remotely coherent counter-argument. So I'll go into my list in full detail in a moment, but here's the full list in brief. Warmongering, Guantanamo concentration camp, surveillance police state laws, creation of the English Defence League, cover-ups of gang rapes, quota-based racism, sexism and tokenism, hatred of Britain and British identity, promotion of the BNP and extreme right-wing groups, promotion of an increased class divide, driving down of wages for low earners, and opposition to free speech and promotion of political correctness hate speech. Okay, so let's cover each point in detail. Number 1. Warmongering. The last Labour government dragged Britain into supporting 2 US imperialist wars for geopolitical and natural resource domination in the Middle East. This directly resulted in the suffering and deaths of hundreds of thousands of foreign people. So when you see Labour Party conferences and promotional materials which tend to use the colour red, remember that Labour is a party that has the red blood of hundreds of thousands of foreigners on its hands. Number 2. Guantanamo concentration camp. When last in office, the Labour Party wholly supported the US Guantanamo Bay concentration camp, sending demonised British Muslims and Asians to be incarcerated long-term without proper legal representation and even to be tortured. Was it a fascist thing to do? Yes, it was. Number 3. Surveillance police state laws. As part of the fascist war on terror, Labour sought to take advantage of the 9/11 and London bombing attacks to pass a series of domestic surveillance laws that can now be used to spy on the British public. Some of those laws were passed, whilst others, such as ID cards, were met with enough opposition to be stopped. Number 4. Creation of the English Defence League. Although Labour publicly positions itself as being opposed to groupings such as the EDL, it is actually responsible for their growth. The EDL started off in Luton, the town where the London bombers apparently were from. Labour's fascist war on terror created an overwhelming fear of Muslims in Luton, and it is from these roots that the EDL came into existence. The EDL are a direct byproduct of Labour's fear-mongering and racist war on terror. Number 5. Cover-up of gang rapes. Labour's obsession with the promotion of multiculturalism and diversity propaganda is so pervasive that Labour Party-controlled councils have systematically and for over a decade suppressed the reporting and investigation of rapist gangs operating in places like Rotherham, because the perpetrators were ethnic minorities and immigrants. This was systematic racism against the mostly white and British victims of those crimes. This is absolutely inexcusable. Number 6. Quota-based racism, sexism and tokenism. When last in power, Labour worked relentlessly through propaganda to create the now commonplace corporate and governmental culture of quota-based discrimination. Because of Labour, we now find that specific races, genders, nationalities and other social groupings are frequently excluded from being even allowed to apply for particular jobs, training courses and funding opportunities. This is also known as reverse discrimination, or as Labour like to call it, positive action. Labour has justified this institutional bigotry on the assumption that majority groupings in society are always the most privileged and always the least discriminated against, which itself is a bigoted attitude. For example, most people are not rich, but does that mean that rich people are discriminated against more than poor people? No, it doesn't. The assumption that people of certain ethnicities should be penalised in their work opportunities because they happen to share the skin colour of some group of rich people in the past who committed some historical form of genocide or slavery is also a very bigoted view. And the practice of race and gender targeted recruitment and training is also bigoted toward the very groups being targeted for favouritism, because it assumes that those people are otherwise unable to succeed on the strength of their own skills and merit. It assumes that they are somehow incapable in comparison to the majority. Number 7. Hatred of Britain and British identity. The Labour Party is obsessed with the new EU superstate nationalism, which itself is xenophobic towards the identities of individual EU member state nations. Labour absolutely refuses to offer the British people a referendum on EU membership, and it forced the British people into acceptance of the Lisbon Treaty by again firmly rejecting public calls for a referendum. Labour's determination to destroy British identity and surrender the whole country to the institutions of the undemocratic and economically fascist European Union is the key reason why they have tried their hardest to fill this overpopulated country with as many immigrants as possible, and to deny jobs, funding and training opportunities to British people. Their diversity and multiculturalism smokescreen is a flat-out European Union propaganda lie. The multicultural project is actually anti-cultural and xenophobic towards EU member states. Career politicians, especially those of the Labour Party who are pushing this EU integration agenda, are doing so because they want top-paying powerful jobs in the EU institutions, which are fleecing Europeans of their hard-earned taxes. In fact, elected members of the EU Parliament, unlike in Britain, aren't even allowed to propose new laws. That's right, the self-serving EU Commission, whom European people cannot directly vote out, has a monopoly on the proposal of new EU laws. Labour politicians know this, and they don't care. Number 8. Promotion of the British National Party and extreme right-wing groups. Labour's anti-British propaganda has directly resulted in public knee-jerk support for the BNP and other arguably extreme right-wing groups. Some people see the tokenist discrimination that is now commonplace as a result of Labour's last stint in office, but they mistakenly believe it is the fault of the minority groups and immigrants that Labour has been giving favouritism to. As a result, these misguided people join and support organisations that are bigoted towards their perceived minority enemies. It is Labour that has brought this about, and in my opinion, deliberately. For example, just before the EU Parliament elections in 2009, Harriet Harman of Labour publicly demanded that British voters not support BNP as a protest vote. Being that she was and still is one of the most publicly disliked of Labour's leadership, her announcement was guaranteed to increase support for the BNP. The result was that BNP won 2 seats in the EU Parliament that year. This led to public fear of right-wing fascists on the rise, to which Labour stepped forward to offer itself as a supposed fairness and equality solution. But in actual fact, Labour's own brand of bigotry and racism towards British people is directly responsible for the right-wing rise it claims to oppose. Some of you will know this propaganda tactic under its well-known label, divide and conquer. And incidentally, the media doesn't talk about this one very much, but most BNP supporters are actually ex-Labour Party supporters. In other words, racism isn't limited to right-wing politics, it also exists on the left. Number 9. Promotion of an increased class divide. During Labour's last stint in power, a small number of minority groups were marginally helped up the economic ladder, and were then paraded as supposed evidence of good intentions on the part of the Labour Party. Meanwhile, Labour's love of corporatism, which even extended to the creation of private finance initiatives in the NHS, massively increased the divide between the rich and the middle classes, and social mobility also significantly decreased under Labour when they were last in power. So much for Labour's fairness and equality mantra. Number 10. Driving down of wages for low earners. Again, this ties in with corporatism. Big business loves open-door immigration because it saturates the workforce market, thus allowing corporations and the rich to pay workers less money. Minor increases in the minimum wage merely serve to mask this decline in living standards for the majority, who would otherwise be able to command much better wages if the worker market wasn't saturated. And no, this isn't the fault of immigrants who are simply trying to better their lives. It is the fault of the Labour Party and its corporate allies. And this importing of foreign labour is also arguably racist towards foreign workers, because those people are coming here to be paid lower wages than a British worker would otherwise receive in an unsaturated workforce market. Number 11. Opposition to free speech and promotion of political correctness hate speech. The Labour Party has sought to control public opinion by imposing its own opinions of what constitutes acceptable language and imagery. For example, the now common practice of hiring ethnic minority or disabled people specifically so that they can be put on display to advertise an organisation's supposedly diverse and multicultural credentials is itself bigoted. It's bigoted towards the employees being put on display as identity tokens, and it's bigoted towards those who are rejected for such jobs because they don't fit the right tokenist identity boxes. And then there's the control of language. Aside from being anti-democratic, being that you can't have democracy without free speech, much of the political conformity language that Labour has promoted is in itself bigoted. For example, the categorising of people onto a colour chart of ethnic labels is misleading. White people, if you stand them against a white background, aren't actually white, and most black people have a skin colour that is some variation on the colour brown. Although Labour didn't invent these divisive black and white labels, it does promote them relentlessly, encouraging people to view themselves and others in distinct colour chart categories, or even like pieces on a chessboard. Labour then applies a hierarchy system in which certain groups are to be given favouritism, while others are to be denied opportunities. Labour also seeks to brand specific political opinions as hate speech, but often it is an expression of Labour's own hateful mindset towards certain groups. For example, under Labour's ideology, certain groups are to receive special protection from verbal insult, whilst others are expected to wear a thick skin and just deal with insulting language. For example, to call someone a Paki, as in Pakistani, is considered a major insult, but to call someone a Brit, as in British, is acceptable. To insult someone about their skin colour is considered hate speech, yet to insult someone about their weight, intelligence, hair colour, or facial attractiveness is acceptable. Try holding a public celebration day for your white pride, if that's how you categorise yourself. Labour would object to such activity as racist, even though Labour itself actively encourages and funds racial, sexual and gender pride events for other groups. Personally, I just consider myself a British citizen because I'm what's called a civic nationalist, meaning a nationalist who disregards ethnicity. Civic nationalism is a term you virtually never hear mentioned by Europhiles and Labour Party supporters and members because they want you to falsely believe that nationalism is always inherently driven by ethnic hatred. Labour's promotion of politically correct conformist language barriers isn't about fairness, it's about controlling the course of political debate to force the public to accept Labour's pro-EU social engineering agendas. So there you have it, 11 reasons why Labour is the most bigoted, racist, fascist and dangerous political party in Britain. Unfortunately, many British people still believe that Labour represents the same working class values that it did decades ago. Others, especially politically inexperienced young people, are duped by its false claims to the moral high ground of fairness and equality. Political parties should always be judged by their track record and their policies rather than their ideological words. The Labour Party talks endlessly about fairness and equality and socialism, but when last in office for 3 consecutive terms, it showed itself to be an authoritarian, bigoted, warmongering and corrupt political force. But what makes it especially dangerous is that its members and supporters tend to actually believe the party's false morality front, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary.